In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, I'm going to be comparing the Barbarian, the Fighter, and the Monk. This is because I think people are going to be comparing Fighter and Barbarian a lot. And I also think that Monk needs to be in somewhere in sort of some comparison. It's kind of an outlier in terms of how it compares to certain classes, but people have been asking for Monk in this video, and I think it's a good place to put it because, what classes do you compare Monk to really? Probably be some form of other martial classes. So this is a good place to put Monk. And we're going to go through these and sort of look at them. We did Fighter once before. I think you'll see it a little bit differently here compared to Barbarian and Monk, even though some of this information will be the same. But let's jump into it. So comparing these three classes during character creation, the first thing you'll notice is that Barbarians have the most health, Fighters are in second place, and Monks are behind Fighters. Barbarians actually have the highest starting health pool in the game, and they typically gain the most health per class depending on what their Constitution modifier is. So if you want the highest possible health, you'll probably choose a Barbarian. Moving along to armor proficiencies, Barbarians have light armor, medium armor, and shields. Fighters have all armor types, including heavy, and they have shields as well, while Monks have no armor proficiencies, nor do they have proficiency with shields. And one might think that Fighter has an advantage over Barbarian here because of the heavy armor proficiency, but Barbarians are actually penalized for using heavy armor in some cases, and sometimes they also run unarmored, though I do think most Barbarians early game will use some armor. We'll get into that in a minute. And Monks have no armor. They are actually rewarded for being, unarmored in this game, so there are reasons why you might not run armor on them. You could pick up some proficiencies with like Githyanki, for instance, or you could multi-class one level with a Fighter, something like that, to pick up some, medium armor proficiency if you wanted to use that at the beginning of the game. But there are reasons they may not want to do that, and we'll get into them more when we go into the Monk class. And then talking a bit about the weapon proficiencies, Barbarians and Fighters have the same with Simple and Martial, with Monk being a bit behind with Simple and Short Swords. So just generally speaking, if you're just talking about like the weapons that deal more damage, martial weapons typically deal more damage. So usually Fighter and Barbarian are going to come out a little bit ahead in terms of Monk here if you're just talking about character creation. And for saving throw proficiencies, Barbarians and Fighters have exactly the same, no difference there, while Monks have Strength and Dexterity. So the difference here is that they have Dexterity, while Fighters and Barbarians have Con. Con is a really good saving throw, but so is Dexterity, so these kind of come out evenly, and you're going to have good saving throw proficiencies with either of these three classes. Talking a bit about skills, none of these classes is focused particularly on skills. They all get to pick two, and Fighters and Barbarians can choose Intimidation if, for some reason you really want to have extra intimidation and your Fighter or Barbarian is going to be your main talking person. I don't recommend this, but if that's something that you want to do, keep that in mind. Monk has no dialogue proficiencies to speak of, so you probably wouldn't handle dialogue ever on a Monk. So let's talk a little bit about Barbarians first. Historically, these are the uber strength class in most RPGs, and it's typically been no different in D&D as well. But there are some changes between tabletop and Baldur's Gate 3 that I want to mention here. And the first thing we're going to talk a bit about is Rage, which is their class feature, and it's kind of the staple of Barbarians. What this does is it allows them to use their Rage as a bonus action, and while they're raging, they deal 2 extra damage with their melee and improvised weapons, and when throwing objects, and they also have resistance to physical damage and advantage on strength checks and saving throws. However, your Rage ends early if you haven't attacked a creature on your turn or you didn't take damage from your last turn. So you basically have to attack every turn or get hit every turn or your Rage ends. This lasts 10 turns typically, and you have a fixed number of these charges that you can use per long rest. A couple of things about Rage though, you cannot rage while you're wearing heavy armor, and you cannot concentrate or cast spells while you're raging. So Barbarians are going to make bad choices from multi-classing with, spellcasters that are going to be casting spells in combat because Barbarians are going to want to use their Rage class feature, and this is going to prevent them from casting spells in combat. And the big change here from tabletop to BG3 is that Rage also applies to Dexterity and Finesse-based melee attacks instead of just Strength-based melee attacks like tabletop. So now you could be a Dexterity fighter and use Finesse weapons and still take advantage of Rage, although you may not want to do that because this extra damage is also applied to throwing, and throwing is usually based off your strength. So you could do Dexterity as long as you plan to not throw things, but you might still want to do Strength if you plan on using throwing, which is a big part of playing a Barbarian in my opinion. So the next thing Barbarians gain at level 1 is Unarmored Defense, and this allows them to not only add their Dexterity modifier to their armor class like everybody else, but also their Constitution, which is unique to their class. So let's say you had 14 Dexterity and 16 Constitution, this would give you +5 to your armor class. Since you have 10 by default, that would be 15 armor class. And let's say you're using a shield, that's 17 armor, because you can use a shield and still do this. And I think a lot of people have a tendency to see this class feature and think, okay, barbarians must play on armor. They need to take advantage of this. It's built into their class. But I think you can make a case, particularly at the beginning of the game when ability scores are lower, to use something like medium armor. For instance, if a barbarian decides to use medium armor at the beginning and they equip scale mail, which is 14 armor class, and then they add their +2 dexterity to that, they come out with 16 armor, and if they use a shield, that's 18 armor. That's actually 1 armor ahead. And keep in mind that, you know, you can find like a +1 version of scale mail or a +2 version that adds even more armor. Or maybe you find an armor that has a cool effect on it that you want for your barbarian. So I think there is a case to use light and medium armor for your barbarian, and don't just assume you should always play on armored. Look at your particular barbarian and make the best decision for you. Keep in mind too that there is also clothing in Baldur's Gate 3 that isn't technically armor, that doesn't add armor class to you, but also has special effects. So maybe that's what you want to use, and then you would still be considered on armor. But I just wanted to give you an idea that just because you see this as a class feature, it doesn't mean that you need to play unarmored as a barbarian in Baldur's Gate 3. And the next thing barbarians gain at level 2 is reckless attack, and this allows them to gain advantage on their melee attack rolls for 1 turn, in exchange for having enemies have advantage on their attack rolls against the barbarian during their turn. So you're going to be more likely to connect with your attacks when you use reckless attack, but you're also going to be more likely to take damage. And one difference between reckless attack in BG3 and tabletop is that previously this was attacks made with strength. In this game, you can use attacks with dexterity or strength on your reckless attack. As I mentioned earlier, there's been kind of a shift away from strength specifically on rage and reckless attack. So if you want to make a dexterity barbarian, you can absolutely do that and still use reckless attack. Again, there are reasons to still use strength. For instance, if you plan to throw things effectively, but you could do this with dexterity as well, BG3. And you can see between rage and reckless attack that barbarians have more of a focus on melee combat than fighter does, because you have to use the extra damage from rage if you're, attacking in melee range, or if you're throwing something. So, if you're using a bow, that does not apply, and if you're using reckless attack, it needs to be a melee attack. So these things make barbarian a bit of a melee specialist compared to like a fighter that has more flexibility between ranged and melee combat, and also kind of makes them similar to paladins in a way, right? Paladins are going to be using divine smite only in melee combat, so they're going to try and get into melee to use that because that's what's really strong about their class, while barbarians are going to try and get into melee in order to use reckless attack. And at level 5, barbarians also gain extra attack, which allows them to attack twice in a given turn in combat, just like fighters and monks. So there's no advantage here between those 3 classes in that regard, since they all have that at level 5. Another thing barbarians gain at this level, though, is increased movement speed, allowing them to move probably further than fighter, although monks can move very far as well. But again, this movement speed is only allowed if they're not wearing heavy armor, which is a reason that barbarians will probably never wear heavy armor between that and rage. And as they level up, barbarians are going to gain advantage on their initiative rolls in combat, making it so it's more likely that they'll go first or take an earlier turn than enemies. And if they are surprised and they're not incapacitated, they'll still get to take their turn in combat, which can be huge, because a lot of times when you get surprised in BG3, it can be absolutely devastating. And then at level 9, barbarians are going to gain increased critical damage, which is not something most builds focus on in BG3 and 5e, but it's something that will increase your damage, periodically, which is nice to have. So then let's take a look at the barbarian subclasses. These are Berserker, Wild Heart, and Wild Magic. So Berserker essentially changes your rage ability into Frenzy, and what Frenzy does is it gives you access to Frenzied Strike and Enraged Throw while you're basically raged. And what Frenzied Strike does is it allows you to make a melee attack with your weapon as a bonus action. So at level 5, a barbarian could take 2 attacks and then use their bonus action for a 3rd attack, which can be a lot of damage to say the least. Or they can use Enraged Throw with their bonus action, which allows them to pick up an item or a creature and throw it at a target, dealing damage and knocking it prone. And the damage that you deal depends on the item that you're throwing, the weight it is, your strength, etc. But knocking things prone is great in this game for a melee character, because enemies that are prone, you have advantage on your attacks against them. So if you knock an enemy prone and then run over to it and attack it, you're going to have advantage even if you don't use reckless attack. And you can see the Berserker even leans in harder into the rage mechanic in melee combat by, further giving you melee attacks. And then you have the Wild Heart subclass, which is similar to the Path of the Totem Warrior from the 5e handbook. And what this subclass does is it further impacts your rage in a different way than Berserker's Frenzy does, and it kind of give you aspects of an animal of your choosing, which gives you passive benefit while you're raging, but also gives you an additional ability that you can use in combat. For instance, Rage Bearheart gives you Unrelenting Ferocity, which is a skill that heals you in combat as an action if you want. And it also gives you even more resistances to different damage types, so it makes you harder to kill while you're raging. And as you level up, you'll gain more aspects of different animals, and these will apply various effects to your character, making them stronger in and out of combat. And you'll also gain access to speak with animals. So if you're someone who wants to interact with the animals of the game, but you don't have like a druid in your group or something like that, then you could use a barbarian of this subclass in order to do that instead. And then the Wild Magic Barbarian is similar to the Wild Magic Sorcerer in the sense that when they do certain things, it's going to trigger a roll on the Wild Magic table, which can generate very positive effects or very negative effects or completely bizarre effects. So if you want to play like a really spontaneous playthrough, you might choose the Wild Magic Barbarian. So moving along to Fighter, fighters gain a fighting style at level 1, and they have access to all 6 fighting styles, whether that's archery or dual wielding or sword and shielding it or two-handing it. They have access to all of them. So they have the most versatility from fighting styles to choose from all the classes. And they also gain Second Wind, which allows them to heal themselves once every short rest. And then at level 2, fighters gain Action Surge, which allows them to take a second action in combat once every short rest. And this is huge because fighters gain extra attack at level 5, and they'll be able to do a second attack every round as long as they do an attack with their action. And what's great about Action Surge is that if you, at level 5, if you do an attack and then an extra attack, and then you use Action Surge, you'll be able to do another attack as an action and then get that extra attack since you used attack as an action 2 times. And at level 11, fighters will gain 2 extra attacks if they use attack as an action. So this means using Action Surge, they could potentially attack 6 times in a round once they're level 11. And as I mentioned in the other video, a lot of classes will dip a couple levels into Fighter just to pick up this ability. It is very, very strong at being able to replenish it at short rest, and it can give you a huge burst, particularly on classes that have extra attack. This is Paladin, Fighter, Barbarian, Ranger, Monk. All of these classes have the extra attack action. Even College of Valor or College of Sword Bards have this. So potentially, they could gain, up to 2 more attacks if they use Action Surge. And then at level 3, they're going to choose their subclass, and this is either going to be Champion, Battle Master, or Eldritch Knight. So moving along to Champion, champions gain an increased critical strike chance. Normally you have to roll a 20 to critically strike. They can roll a 19 or 20, so they basically have double the chance, which isn't a high chance, granted, but it is double. And they also gain a second fighting style. So maybe you pick archery for one of your fighting styles so that you have a better chance to connect with ranged attacks with your bows and long, crossbows. And maybe you pick something like 2-weapon fighting so that you're good at dual wielding as well. These are the sort of things you can do when you're playing a champion, and those decisions are up to you. And Battle Master gains a resource called Superiority Die that they can use to do various things in combat, notably increasing their damage on an attack, plus adding some sort of effect like push, like knocking an enemy back, knocking them prone, which you gain advantage on attack rolls against prone enemies when you're meleeing, so that's huge. Sometimes you can disarm them. They add a variety of effects that they can do to their attacks. And these are both ranged and melee, mind you, so they can do them from distance or at close. And they can also give temporary health to another target, stuff like this. And this is a finite resource that will replenish when you rest, so you can't do this all the time. But it does boost their martial prowess significantly. And then we move to Eldritch Knight, which is sort of a combination between Fighter and Wizard. And they gain access to, some spells from the Wizard spell list, not nearly as much as a Wizard naturally. They also use intelligence for their spellcasting modifier, which is important if you want to throw hostile spells, because this makes them more likely to connect on targets. Intelligence is not as important on an Eldritch Knight if you only plan to take buff spells or maybe something like Magic Missile that never misses. So keep those things in mind. But generally speaking, if you're going to play an Eldritch Knight, you probably want to have some intelligence in your fighter build besides strength or dexterity and constitution. So if you just take a look at Barbarian and Fighter from what I've said so far, you can see that fighters can use heavy armor. They don't have the same restriction of Barbarians, so that's something that they can do. They can be strength or dexterity focused, just like Barbarians, but they can play at range. They can take the archery fighting style and focus on ranged attacks if they want. They take something like Battle Master. A lot of the abilities that they can use there also apply to ranged attacks. So they don't have to play in melee as much as a Barbarian would. So if you're a character that wants to make a fighter or a warrior type character that's melee and ranged, Fighter is a better choice than Barbarian, or one that's exclusively ranged, Fighter is a better choice than Barbarian. But if you want more of a melee focused character, Barbarian's probably going to come out a bit ahead over Fighter. All right, so let's take a look at Monk. Monks have a resource called Key, and what they use this key for is usually bonus attack actions or bonus spells that they want to do on top of their attacks in combat. And this is a finite resource that will increase over time as they level up. I think it goes up 1 per level, if I'm not mistaken. You actually gain it at level 1 in BG3 compared to level 2 in the handbook. So this is a little bit of a departure there. And then monks gain something called martial arts, which gives them a couple of passive things that they can do. First of all, they can use dexterity as their attack and damage rolls on unarmed attacks and attacks with monk weapons. And they can also do an unarmed attack as a bonus action if they attack unarmed or with one of these monk weapons in combat. So they can always do like at least one attack if they're using monk weapons, and then also a bonus unarmed attack. So that gives them a lot of attacks pretty early in the game. Even though unarmed attacks typically do a little bit less damage than regular attacks, they still can do 2 in 1 round from the very beginning of the game. And this typically makes Monk a very melee-focused class, because in order to take advantage of an extra unarmed attack as a bonus action, you have to be in melee range, because you can't throw your fist through the air, at least not to my knowledge. So monks are predominantly going to play melee characters because of this, and also because of their Flurry of Blows class feature as well. And Flurry of Blows allows the monk to use one of those key points that I mentioned earlier as a bonus action to attack unarmed twice. So regularly you'd just be able to attack once after you do like an attack action with a monk weapon or unarmed. But in this case, you'd actually be able to attack unarmed twice. So you're going to do even more damage, but you're going to use part of your key resource in order to do that. So, but you can't, again, do an unarmed attack from range. So the monk has a lot more of a focus of melee combat than ranged combat typically. And just like barbarians, monks gain unarmored defense, except barbarians use constitution and dexterity for their armor class when unarmored, and monks use wisdom and dexterity. So monks are going to have a good amount of wisdom or some wisdom in their build typically to take advantage of this. And this makes them multi-class very well with other wisdom-based classes like ranger, druid, and cleric, for example. And you might pick up like 1 level of monk on your cleric or druid in order to remain unarmored with those classes, and then pick up extra armor class while doing so. So there are some benefits there, and they have a nice synergy with other wisdom-based classes because of this feature. And monks also gain unarmored movement at level 2, which increases their movement speed by a bit while they're not wearing armor or using a shield. So this further incentivizes them to not wear armor between that and their wisdom modifier being added to their armor class while not wearing armor. I think you'll see a lot more monks playing unarmored than barbarians for this reason, to get more out of that movement speed. And this puts monks in a bit of a precarious situation, because without armor and, just using their dexterity and wisdom, they have to have very high dexterity and wisdom to have a decent armor class, right? Like you're going to want to have like at least 16 dexterity and probably at least 14 wisdom to have 15 armor class. You can't use a shield with unarmed movement. So you're looking at 15 armor class. That's not very high, which means that they need all the help they can get in armor class, and they have less HP than both the barbarian and fighter, and they typically are going to have less armor class as well, unless they get some powerful items that help to boost their armor class. So definitely on your monk, if you can do anything to increase their armor class via spells, buffs, equipment that you find, it would be good, because they're not going to stand in the thick of it like fighters and barbarians are and not die as easily. Monks are more like get into combat, hit something, get out, or, hit and run type tactics typically work a bit better with monk than they do, standing there tanking hits over and over. But one thing that really helps the monks stay alive on the front lines is their deflect missiles class feature. And what this does is it gives them the opportunity to reduce the damage of a ranged weapon attack that hits them in combat to 0. They have an opportunity to do that by rolling a die, by applying their dexterity modifier and their monk level, and if it's, equal to or greater than the number of damage they would take, they reduce it to 0. But then they can also fling that missile back if they reduce it to 0, back at the person that shot at them, and then hit them for damage using their reaction in combat. This greatly helps them stay alive. Because they have lower armor class than probably barbarian or fighter in general, they're typically going to get hit more often by these ranged attacks, and then having high dexterity is going to help you really, mitigate that damage when that happens, and also fling those missiles back, dealing damage. It's really, really fun to do in combat as well. And at level 5, as I mentioned, monks gain extra attack. So they're on par with fighters and barbarians at this point. They all 3 have extra attack at level 5, so they'll be able to attack twice. And again, if they attack with a monk weapon or unarmed, they're going to be able to use Flurry of Blows as their bonus action, or attack with an unarmed strike as a bonus action. So they'll actually be able to attack 3 times at this point, where fighters will be able to attack twice. And berserkers, if you're a berserker barbarian, they'll also be able to attack twice and then use their bonus attack for a weapon attack as well. So I think berserkers are a little bit ahead of monks here. Monks are a little bit ahead of fighters, unless fighter is using action surge. And at level 7, monks are also going to gain evasion, which allows them to, when they succeed on a dexterity saving throw that would still normally deal damage to them, like if it would deal half damage even if they succeed in combat for like a spell that they're defending against, they'll take 0 damage. And this is similar to, well, the rogue gets the same thing. So it's a similar type of class feature to the rogue. So then moving on to the monk subclasses, they are Way of the Open Hand, Way of Shadow, and Way of the Four Elements. And Way of the Open Hand is basically focused on Flurry of Blows and buffs Flurry of Blows by giving you more Flurry of Blow options that do various things in combat, like knock the enemy prone, etc. So if you really like using Flurry of Blows on your monk, and as you get higher and you gain more ki and this becomes more of a regular thing for you, having a more effective Flurry of Blows is what kind of Way of the Open Hand is all about. And Way of Shadow is kind of the ninja class, as Sven put it in his presentation, and it allows the monk a certain element of stealth and allows them a couple of abilities, which I'll get into. So initially, Way of the Shadow monks are not only going to be able to use their ki for Flurry of Blows, but they'll also be able to use it for darkness, for dark vision, pass without a trace, or silence. All these things have to do with, seeing in the dark, putting darkness, or making things silent, making stealth checks. So you can see how that kind of ties into being a ninja a little bit. And then at level 6, Way of the Shadow monks gain something called Shadow Step, which allows them to teleport up to 60 feet and then gain advantage on their next melee attack roll. Now, they can't do this completely freely. They have to do this when they're in dimly lit or dark place. So these monks are going to want to stick to the shadows in order to be able to use this ability, and it's going to be better in some circumstances than others. But this is huge, right? Because most enemies in combat are within 60 meters. Not always, but a lot of the time. And you can go up or down because it's a teleport ability, get next to an enemy, and then almost guaranteed to hit them because of advantage. And again, this is one of the reasons that monks are more melee-oriented than ranged-oriented, because you have Way of the Open Hand, which focuses on using Flurry of Blows, which is, a melee range, and then getting advantage on a melee attack after you teleport is melee-based. So monks tend to lean a little bit more to the melee side. And then once they're a level 11, they're going to be able to turn invisible as an action, and they have to do this, in a dimly lit or dark place. And this invisibility will break if they, do something. So this is going to be primarily useful outside of combat, like if you need to sneak by an area, or like you want to get behind a guy to get something, or maybe make a distraction, etc. It'll primarily be used outside of combat, but it's still extremely strong. And Way of the Four Elements monk is kind of supposed to be like a hybrid between a monk and a spellcaster, and what it does is it allows you to use your ki as a bonus action in order to cast a spell after an attack. So, and these are going to be focused around the elements generally, not always, but generally around the elements. For instance, you could do Thunder Wave, or you could do Fireball using a lot of ki points, and it gives you a bit of flexibility in terms of what you can do as a monk. And one of the issues with Way of the Four Elements, though, is that a lot of these spells cost a lot of ki, and you don't have a lot of ki early on in the game, which means that once you've, burnt through your ki, you're back to using just your regular unarmed attack as your bonus action every turn, which puts you right back in melee range. But now you don't have the option to use Flurry of Blows because you've burnt through all your ki. So you have less options in melee combat, but you have more options at range. So that's kind of the trade-off. So all in all, Monk is a bit more mobile than the other classes that I mentioned in this list. And one thing I didn't mention either that I'll mention here is that you can also make it so that if you use ki, you can make dash or disengage a bonus action and get away from enemies or get further on in combat. So you not only have more movement speed if you're unarmored, but then you can use dash as a bonus action using a ki point, get even further, and then do your attack. So monks have a bit of a focus on mobility. They're a little bit slipperier with deflect missile against ranged attacks. But you definitely don't want to surround them with a bunch of melee enemies because they're not as tanky as a fighter or a barbarian is. And with monks, you're going to focus primarily on dexterity and wisdom in order to gain higher armor class and also to gain more attack damage. And, you're going to be attacking with dexterity most of the time. You could do strength if you want. It's not like you have to do dexterity. But since dexterity adds to your armor class, and because deflect missile operates off your dexterity, you're almost always going to be playing a dexterity-based monk. So the too long didn't read of it is barbarians lean a little bit more to the strength side of things because of the fact that they throw things. Which is benefited from your strength, even though rage and reckless attack no longer are strength only in BG3. They still lean a little bit that way because of the throwing mechanic in this game. And another reason that barbarians will still lean a little bit towards the strength side of things, even though with the changes to reckless attack and rage, is because of the great weapon master feat that a lot of people like to take on their barbarian. And what this feat does is it makes it so that when a melee attack scores a critical hit or kills a creature, which is what you're really aiming to do, you can make another melee attack as a bonus action. However, when you attack with heavy weapons you're proficient with, you gain -5 penalty on your attack roll, but you increase the damage by 10. And this penalty to attack is usually offset by the reckless attack class feature of the barbarian, making them able to use it very effectively. But you use this with heavy weapons, and heavy weapons in this game are strength-based, not dexterity. So if you want to take advantage of Great Weapon Master, if you pick it up as a feat, you're going to need to have strength, and Barbarian is one of the few classes that can take very good advantage of this. Fighters sit a little bit more in the middle, being able to be flexible between strength or dexterity. Whichever they want to do is totally fine. They can attack at range or melee, however they want. Those are totally up to them. And monks are primarily focused on dexterity because of the way their martial arts work, because of the armor class they gain from it, and because of Deflect Missile, which uses their dexterity in order to calculate that. So that's kind of the spectrum there, and you can kind of see the differences. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about multi-class. We'll talk about Barbarian first. But before I mention, like what classes I think, I do want to mention that I think people are going to be thinking, oh, I should gain, Monk and Barbarian together to gain both unarmored defenses. Then I can have Constitution, Wisdom, and Dexterity all applying to my armor class. It doesn't work like that. You can only have one unarmored defense, either Constitution or Wisdom. You can't have both. So don't think that's the thing in this game, because it's not. Okay, so let's talk about Barbarian first. I think probably the two classes you'll see Barbarian multi-classing with the most are probably Fighter and Paladin. Fighter, they can pick up a fighting style, which will help them out. Maybe a melee one. That would be good for them. And also, if they take 2 levels, they can gain Action Surge, which is, just about good for any other class. So that's a really good synergy there. Another good combination for Barbarians is Paladin, and you might be thinking, what? Because Barbarians do not multi-class well with other spellcasting classes, because when they rage, they cannot cast spells. So that kind of defeats the purpose a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the time. And Paladins can cast some spells. However, they can use their spell slots for Divine Smite, so this does not become a problem when you're raging as a Barbarian. You can still gain extra damage and then use Divine Smite. So there is some nice synergy there as well. And then Paladins can cast spells when they're not raging if they want, or outside of combat, which is typically where a Paladin would cast spells anyway. Talking a bit about Fighters. Fighters multi-class well with just about any class in the game. They're probably the most flexible class because of Action Surge at level 2 that just benefits pretty much any build. They bring a lot of proficiencies to the table when you multi-class with them. So if you're like a spellcaster who wants Action Surge and also some proficiencies, maybe some armor, this is a great way to pick it up. So Fighters can pretty much multi-class with anyone. And talking a little bit about multi-classing of Monk, I already mentioned that they multi-class very well with other Wisdom-focused characters like Cleric, Druid, or Ranger, but they also multi-class well for Fighter, for Action Surge, and to pick up a fighting style. But they also multi-class well with Barbarians, because in BG3, Barbarians' Rage and Reckless Attack do not need strength, and Monks always focus on Dexterity. If you don't mind playing a Barbarian that's not really going to throw things, but is going to focus on Dexterity, even though their unarmored defense does not stack, there is some synergy there. Rage applies to each attack you do, and when you're using Flurry of Blows, you do 2 attacks, so that might actually increase your damage when doing Flurry of Blows significantly. Some of these things need testing, of course, and time will tell what all the best multi-classing is, and we will have a multi-classing video at launch, with the full version of the game, so we can say accurately these things work or don't through testing. But I hope you guys found this video useful and this series of videos useful, comparing different classes. I feel like it's great to learn about a class in this game, and by all means, go watch other class guides out there. But sometimes having the information correlated against another piece of information is more useful than just learning it at, one at a time. I think the next video that I'm going to do is a party optimization video talking about party synergy and, the class roles in a group, what works well together, what classes don't work well together, or are not optimal, rather. You can play a party in this game of whatever builds you want. But I think we're going to have a video kind of talking a bit about what would be optimal in this game, not knowing anything, and what you might do on that. So stay tuned for that soon as well.